Most people think wars begin with bombs, tanks, and soldiers. But the most powerful war of the 21st century started quietly. No explosions, no headlines, no breaking news alerts. It began in factories, trade deals, currency markets, shipping routes, and data centers. While the world was busy watching elections, pandemics, and conflicts on TV, two superpowers were locking horns in an economic battle that shapes your job, your savings, your phone, and even the price of your groceries. This is the war you were never meant to notice. America and China are not just competing nations. They represent two completely different visions of how power works in the modern world. One relies on open markets, private companies, and global finance. The other uses state control, long-term planning, and industrial dominance. For decades, these two systems appeared to benefit each other. Cheap goods flowed west. Capital and technology flowed east. Everyone thought this relationship was permanent. That assumption was wrong. This is not a story about who is good or who is evil. It is a story about leverage, about dependence, about what happens when the world's largest economy realizes it no longer controls the system it built, and what happens when a rising power decides it no longer wants to play by someone else's rules. To understand this hidden economic war, we have to go back to where it all began. In the late 20th century, China was poor, isolated, and technologically behind. The United States, on the other hand, stood alone at the top of the global order after the Cold War. American leaders believed that bringing China into the global trading system would change it. The logic was simple. Trade would create a middle class. A middle class would demand political freedom. And eventually, China would become more like the West. That belief shaped decades of policy. Factories were moved. Supply chains were rebuilt. American companies rushed into China, chasing lower labor costs and massive new markets. In return, China gained access to technology, investment, and the world's largest consumer base. On paper, it looked like a win-win deal. In reality, it created one of the most unbalanced economic relationships in modern history. China did not just become the world's factory. It became the backbone of global manufacturing. Electronics, pharmaceuticals, machinery, clothing, rare earth materials, and even components used in U.S. military systems increasingly depended on Chinese production. Over time, this dependence became invisible. Americans still saw full store shelves and low prices. What they didn't see was how fragile the system had become. At the same time, China was not playing the same game as the United States. While American companies focused on quarterly profits and shareholder value, China focused on decades. Its government directed credit, protected domestic champions, and quietly absorbed foreign technology. Joint ventures often meant forced knowledge sharing. Intellectual property rules were flexible. Market access was conditional. But Western companies accepted these terms because the profits were too tempting to ignore. By the early 2000s, the results were clear. China's economy was growing at historic speed. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. Entire cities rose from farmland. Ports, highways, and factories expanded faster than anything the world had ever seen. Meanwhile, many American manufacturing towns hollowed out. Jobs disappeared. Wages stagnated. The benefits of globalization were real, but uneven. For years, these warning signs were ignored. Cheap goods kept inflation low. Corporate profits soared. Wall Street thrived. As long as the stock market went up, few asked hard questions about long-term risk. But underneath the surface, power was shifting. The 2008 global financial crisis was a turning point. While the United States struggled with collapsing banks and unemployment, China launched massive state-led stimulus programs. It built infrastructure at breathtaking scale and doubled down on industrial expansion. To Chinese leaders, the crisis confirmed something important. The Western financial system was unstable, and relying on it forever would be dangerous. From that moment on, China's strategy became clearer. Reduce dependence on the U.S., control critical industries, secure resources, build parallel systems. Not to destroy the existing global order overnight, but to be ready if it ever turned hostile. The United States, meanwhile, was slow to react. Political divisions, short election cycles, and corporate lobbying made long-term economic strategy difficult. While China planned decades ahead, America debated year to year. The imbalance continued to grow. Then came the realization. By the mid-2010s, U.S. policymakers across the political spectrum began to agree on something rare. The relationship with China was no longer just economic. It was strategic, and it was risky. The first visible cracks appeared with trade disputes. Tariffs were imposed. Accusations flew. Headlines spoke of trade wars. But tariffs were only the surface. The real conflict was deeper and far more complex. At the heart of this economic war is technology. In the modern world, power is not just about GDP. It is about who controls advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, telecommunications, and data. These are the tools that shape military strength, economic growth, and global influence. China understood this early. The United States assumed its dominance was permanent. China launched ambitious plans to dominate high-tech sectors. It invested heavily in education, research, and state-backed companies. It sought self-sufficiency in critical technologies, especially those controlled by foreign suppliers. Semiconductors became a top priority. These tiny chips power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Without them, modern economies grind to a halt. The problem for China was simple. The most advanced chips and the machines needed to make them were controlled by companies aligned with the United States and its allies. This created a choke point, and choke points are weapons in economic warfare. When the U.S. began restricting access to advanced technology, it sent shockwaves through the global system. These were not traditional sanctions aimed at punishment. They were strategic controls designed to slow China's technological rise. To Washington, this was about national security. To Beijing, it looked like containment. What followed was escalation, but not the kind people expected. China did not respond with tanks or missiles. It responded with investment, diversification, and quiet retaliation. It increased funding for domestic chip makers. It strengthened ties with resource-rich nations. It expanded its influence in emerging markets through infrastructure and financing. It used its dominance in certain supply chains as leverage. This is what makes the economic war so difficult to see. There are no front lines, no surrender ceremonies. Just pressure, counter-pressure, and constant maneuvering. Currency plays a role too. The US dollar has long been the backbone of global finance. It gives the United States enormous power, from sanctions enforcement to borrowing at low cost. China knows this. That is why it has slowly worked to reduce its exposure to the dollar system. Trade agreements in local currencies, alternative payment systems, growing gold reserves. These moves rarely make headlines, but together they signal a long-term shift. Another battlefield is global influence. The United States built institutions after World War II that shaped trade, finance, and development. For decades, these institutions reflected American values and priorities. China initially worked within this system. But as its power grew, it began building alternatives. New development banks, new trade routes, new partnerships, especially in regions where US influence had faded. This is not charity. It is strategy. Infrastructure creates dependence. Financing creates leverage. And influence creates options when conflicts arise. At home, both countries face internal pressures that shape their strategies. In the United States, voters are increasingly skeptical of globalization. They want jobs, security, and stability. In China, economic growth is tied directly to political legitimacy. Slow growth creates risk. That makes this conflict even more dangerous. Neither side can afford to appear weak. Yet despite the rising tension, open conflict remains unlikely. The costs would be catastrophic. The global economy is too interconnected. A full break would hurt everyone. That is why this war is fought in shadows, policies, and supply chains rather than battlefields. For everyday people, the effects are subtle but real. Higher prices, product shortages, shifts in job markets, increased political tension. Decisions made far from public view ripple down into daily life, and this is only the beginning. Because as technology advances, populations age, and global power continues to shift, the stakes of this economic war will only grow. The choices made today will define the next generation. We will go deeper. We will explore how this economic war could reshape the global order, what scenarios lie ahead, and what it all means for the future of America, China, and the rest of the world. The war you don't see on TV may be the most important story of our time. Because the most dangerous phase of any conflict is not the opening move. It is the moment when both sides realize there is no easy exit. The global economy today is standing at that exact point. For years, the United States and China believed they could manage their rivalry without breaking the system. Compete where necessary, cooperate where possible, avoid pushing too far. That balance is now fading. What is replacing it is something far more unstable: selective separation. This does not mean a full economic divorce. That would collapse markets overnight. Instead, it means pulling apart in the areas that matter most: technology, energy, finance, data, military-adjacent industries. The rest of the economy is left connected, but weaker, slower, and more expensive. This strategy has a name in policy circles, but everyday people feel it in simpler ways. Your phone costs more, products take longer to arrive, jobs shift without warning, and uncertainty becomes permanent. One of the biggest misunderstandings about this conflict is the idea that one side will win quickly. That is not how economic wars end. They drag on, they reshape incentives, they change behavior over time. The real outcome is not victory or defeat. It is transformation. Let's start with the most important question. Can the world survive without choosing sides? For decades, countries avoided this choice. They traded with the US for security and finance, and with China for manufacturing and infrastructure. This dual-track system worked because the US and China tolerated it. That tolerance is fading. As pressure increases, neutral countries are being forced into quiet decisions. Where do they build factories? Which technology standards do they adopt? Which payment systems do they rely on? Each choice pulls them closer to one side. This is already visible in supply chains. Companies are moving production out of China, but not always back to the United States. Instead, they go to Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Eastern Europe. On the surface, this looks like diversification. In reality, it is fragmentation. Fragmented systems are more expensive and less efficient. That cost does not disappear. It shows up as inflation, slower growth, and reduced innovation. Economic war has no clean winners. It only decides who absorbs the pain first. China understands this dynamic very well. That is why it is playing a long game. Rather than confronting the US directly across all fronts, it focuses on areas where it already has leverage. One of those areas is critical materials. Modern economies depend on resources that most people never think about. Rare earth elements, battery metals, industrial inputs used in electronics and renewable energy. China dominates the processing of many of these materials, even when it does not control the raw supply. That dominance gives it quiet power. Unlike tariffs or sanctions, resource leverage is subtle. Restrictions can be framed as environmental rules or domestic priorities. The impact is still the same: higher costs, delays, pressure on competitors. The United States is trying to respond by rebuilding domestic capacity and working with allies. But this takes time, years, not months. And time is a weapon in economic warfare. Another battlefield is standards. Who decides how technology works decides who profits from it. From 5G networks to electric vehicle charging systems to artificial intelligence frameworks, standards shape markets for decades. China has become far more aggressive in pushing its standards globally, especially in developing countries. Once a country builds its systems around a specific standard, switching becomes expensive and risky. This creates long-term dependence, even without formal alliances. The US understands this too, but its system relies on private companies rather than state coordination. That creates speed disadvantages. Then there is finance. The US dollar still dominates global trade and investment. This gives Washington unmatched influence. But influence creates incentive for others to find alternatives. China is not trying to replace the dollar overnight. That would be unrealistic. Instead, it is building options. Regional trade settled in local currencies. Cross-border payment systems that bypass traditional networks. Digital currency experiments. None of these threaten the dollar alone. Together, they reduce reliance. Think of it like erosion. No single wave destroys the coastline, but over time, the shape changes. The United States faces a different kind of challenge. Its strength comes from openness, innovation, immigration, deep financial markets. But openness also creates vulnerability. Capital flows where returns are highest. Companies seek efficiency. Technology spreads faster than control. Trying to secure the system without undermining it is one of the hardest policy problems America faces. Too much restriction slows innovation, too little invites strategic risk. There is no perfect balance. This tension is especially clear in technology controls. Restricting access to advanced chips may slow China's progress in the short term. But it also accelerates China's push for self-sufficiency. Once achieved, that independence cannot be undone. Economic pressure often creates the very competitors it was meant to stop. China knows this. It accepts short-term pain for long-term resilience. That willingness is rooted in its political system. Stability is prioritized over immediate comfort. Growth targets matter, but survival matters more. This difference in political structure shapes everything. In the United States, policies change with elections. Strategies must survive public debate, legal challenges, and market reactions. In China, strategies can persist across decades with minimal adjustment. That does not make one system superior. But it does make them operate on different timelines. And timelines matter in economic war. Now consider the role of crises. Crises accelerate change faster than any policy paper ever could. The pandemic exposed supply chain fragility. Geopolitical conflicts exposed energy dependence. Financial shocks test trust in institutions. Each crisis pushes countries to reassess assumptions. Future crises will not pause this economic war. They will intensify it. A major financial disruption could speed up currency diversification. A technology breakthrough could shift power unexpectedly. A regional conflict could force alignment choices overnight. None of these scenarios require direct confrontation between the US and China to reshape the global order. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. Because stability depends not on trust, but on restraint. And restraint is hardest when domestic pressure is high. In China, slowing growth, demographic decline, and debt create urgency. Economic performance is not just about prosperity. It is about legitimacy. That limits how much compromise is possible. In the United States, political polarization and public frustration with globalization reduce patience. Voters want clear results, not long explanations. That rewards tough language and visible action, even when quiet coordination would be more effective. These internal pressures increase the risk of miscalculation. And miscalculation is how economic wars spill into other domains. This does not mean military conflict is inevitable. But it does mean economic tools will increasingly be used as substitutes for force, sanctions, controls, exclusions, strategic partnerships. Each move framed as defensive. Each response seen as provocation. For businesses and investors, this environment changes everything. Efficiency is no longer the only goal. Resilience matters. Political risk is priced in. Decisions once made purely on cost now require strategic thinking. That reduces margins and increases complexity. For workers, the effects are uneven. Some industries benefit from reshoring and government support. Others struggle as global markets fragment. Job security becomes tied to geopolitics, even if no one calls it that. For consumers, the impact is slow but persistent, fewer choices, higher prices. Slower innovation in some areas, faster in others. Convenience becomes more expensive. This is the hidden cost of the war you don't see on TV. So what does the future look like? There are three broad paths forward. The first is managed competition. Both sides accept rivalry, but maintain guardrails. Economic ties remain, but sensitive areas are protected. Communication stays open. This path preserves stability, but requires discipline and trust. The second is deepening fragmentation. Supply chains split. Standards diverge. Financial systems slowly separate. Growth slows globally. Risk increases. This path does not collapse the system, but it weakens it. The third is crisis-driven escalation. A shock forces rapid decoupling in key areas. Markets react violently. Alliances harden. Recovery takes years. This is the most dangerous path and the hardest to reverse. None of these outcomes are predetermined. Policy choices still matter. Leadership still matters. But momentum is real, and momentum is hard to stop. The most important lesson of this economic war is also the simplest. Power today is not just about strength. It is about dependence. Who depends on whom? Who has alternatives? Who can absorb pain longer? These questions define the battlefield. China and the United States are both powerful, both vulnerable. both constrained by their own systems. That makes this conflict less about domination and more about endurance. The world is entering an era where economic decisions carry strategic consequences, whether leaders admit it or not. Ignoring that reality does not make it disappear. It only makes the shock worse when it arrives. This war will not end with a treaty. It will end when a new balance is reached, or when the cost becomes too high to ignore. Until then, it will continue quietly shaping the world behind the headlines. And most people will never realize they are living inside it.